June 12, 2024, the day Venezuela thought it could challenge the USS Gerald R. Ford. Let me tell you about the moment I first realized how badly Caracas had miscalculated. It wasn't the headlines, those came later, with their usual breathless prose about Venezuelan aggression and American resolve. No, it was the satellite imagery. Not the ones released to the public, of course, but the raw, unfiltered feeds that cross my desk when former colleagues in the intelligence community want to know what I make of things. They're at a single-kilo-class submarine, Caribe, lurking in the Caribbean's deeper trenches, its diesel engine silent, its crew no doubt convinced they were about to pull off the kind of asymmetric gambit that would make Tehran or Moscow sit up and take notice. They weren't. And the USS Gerald R. Ford, the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world, wasn't even the real problem. This wasn't just another routine freedom of navigation operation. This was a deliberate test of Venezuelan leadership, cornered by sanctions, inflation, and the slow collapse of its oil-dependent economy, trying to punch above its weight in a region where the US has spent the last century enforcing an unspoken "you don't challenge us here." And for a brief, almost comical moment, Nicolas Maduro's government thought it could rewrite that rule with a single submarine. They were wrong. But the real story isn't about military hardware or naval tactics. It's about what this moment reveals: a microcosm of a global order in flux, where declining powers lash out not because they have a plan, but because they have nothing left to lose. And where the world's sole superpower, despite its overwhelming firepower, is discovering that its ability to shape events is far more fragile than it appears. I've spent 3 decades studying these kinds of crises, first in the Pentagon, then in academia, and now as someone who gets pulled into classified briefings when the situation looks like it might spiral. And what I can tell you is the mainstream narrative around the Caribe incident is dangerously incomplete. It's not just about a submarine and a carrier. It's about the end of an era, the limits of American power, and the quiet, desperate calculations of a regime that knows its days might be numbered. So let's start with what they want you to believe. The official: a simple story of deterrence. According to the Pentagon's initial readout, the incident was a textbook case of American deterrence working as intended. On June 10, U.S. Southern Command detected the Caribe, a Russian-built Kilo-class submarine, moving into position near the Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group as it transited the Caribbean. The submarine, part of Venezuela's modest but symbolically important naval fleet, had been tracked for days, its movements telegraphed by its need to snorkel rising to periscope depth to recharge its batteries, a vulnerability no amount of stealth can fully mask. When the Ford's escort vessels, including the guided missile destroyer USS Laboon, locked onto the Caribe with active sonar, the submarine's captain, likely under orders from Caracas, attempted a simulated torpedo run. It was a feint, a bluff. The Caribe didn't have live ordnance, and even if it had, a Kilo's torpedoes are no match for the layered defenses of a Nimitz-class carrier, let alone the Ford, which is essentially a floating fortress of fifth-generation aircraft, Aegis radar, and electronic warfare suites that can blind an entire fleet. The Laboon responded with a series of sonar pings and, according to unconfirmed reports, a warning shot, a single inert training torpedo fired across the Caribe's bow. The submarine, outmatched and outmaneuvered, submerged and retreated. By June 12, the Caribe was back in Venezuelan waters, and the Ford continued its transit without incident. The message, as Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin put it in a press briefing, was: the United States will not tolerate threats to our forces or our partners in this hemisphere. Venezuela's reckless actions have consequences. The State Department followed up with a statement reaffirming support for Juan Guaido's interim government and warning of further measures if Caracas continued its provocations. The media ran with it. CNN called it a show of force. Fox News framed it as a humiliating defeat for Maduro. The New York Times buried the story on page A12, treating it as a minor footnote in the broader saga of Venezuela's collapse. And that, for most people, was that. Another day, another example of American military supremacy. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not wrong, exactly. The Caribe was outmatched. The Ford did deter the threat. And Maduro did back down. But that's not the whole story. In fact, it's barely half of it. Because if you dig beneath the surface into the intelligence reports, the diplomatic cables, the economic data, what you find isn't a story about American strength. It's a story about American overreach. About a regime in Caracas that is far more desperate and far more dangerous than Washington seems to realize. And about a global order where the rules of the game are being rewritten, not by the strong, but by the reckless. Deconstructing what really happened in the Caribbean. Let's start with the submarine itself. The Caribe is one of two Kilo-class submarines Venezuela purchased from Russia in the early 2010s, part of Hugo Chávez's ill-fated attempt to modernize his military with Moscow's help. These are not cutting-edge vessels, they're diesel-electric, not nuclear, and while they're quiet, they're no match for the U.S. Navy's anti-submarine warfare capabilities. In fact, the Caribe's sister ship, the Sabalo, has been out of commission for years due to lack of maintenance and spare parts. So why did Maduro send the Caribe at all? The official explanation, that it was a routine training exercise, is laughable. Submarines don't train by stalking U.S. carrier groups. The real answer lies in three overlapping crises that have pushed the Maduro regime into a corner. First, the economic collapse. Venezuela's GDP has contracted by over 75% since 2013. Inflation, even after a brief respite from dollarization, is creeping back up. Oil production, the country's lifeblood, has plummeted from 3.5 million barrels per day in the 1990s to barely 700,000 today. And despite recent whispers of a potential easing of U.S. sanctions, the Biden administration has shown no real appetite for a grand bargain with Caracas. Maduro is running out of options. Second, the political isolation. The U.S. and its allies still recognize Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate leader, but the fiction is wearing thin. Even the EU has quietly dropped its support. Maduro, meanwhile, has consolidated power through a combination of repression, co-optation, and sheer exhaustion. Most Venezuelans are too busy trying to survive to mount another uprising. But that doesn't mean he's secure. The military, his last pillar of support, is restless. There have been at least 3 coup attempts in the last 2 years, all of them put down with brutal efficiency. A high-profile victory against the U.S. would be a propaganda coup, a way to rally the troops and remind the generals where their loyalties lie. Third, the geopolitical desperation. Venezuela has spent the last decade cozying up to Russia and China, but neither power has been willing to go to bat for Maduro in any meaningful way. Russia sells him arms and buys his oil, but it's not about to risk a direct confrontation with the U.S. over Caracas. China, meanwhile, has poured billions into Venezuela's oil sector, but it's doing so cautiously, hedging its bets. Maduro knows he's on his own. And when you're a leader with no allies, no money, and no future, you start taking risks. So what was the Caribe's mission, really? It wasn't to sink the Ford. That would have been suicidal. It wasn't even to fire a warning shot. The Kilo class doesn't carry nuclear-tipped torpedoes, and a conventional strike would have been met with overwhelming retaliation. No, the Caribe's job was to get caught. To force the U.S. to react, to create a moment of tension that Maduro could then spin as a David versus Goliath victory back home. And for a few hours, it worked. State-run media in Venezuela trumpeted the heroic resistance of the Caribe's crew. Maduro gave a speech calling the incident a provocation by the U.S. and a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty. The regime's propagandists went into overdrive, framing the Ford's presence as proof of American imperialism. But here's the it didn't matter. Because while Maduro was playing to his domestic audience, the U.S. was playing to a much larger one. The extended geopolitical game of shadows. To understand why this incident matters, you have to way out. The Caribbean isn't just Venezuela's backyard. It's America's backyard. The Monroe Doctrine, the 200-year-old relic of U.S. foreign policy, still casts a long shadow over the region. And while Washington has spent the last 2 decades obsessing over the Middle East, China has been quietly making inroads in Latin America, buying up ports, funding infrastructure projects, and cultivating relationships with governments that the U.S. has either ignored or antagonized. Venezuela is a key piece of that puzzle. It's not just about oil. It's about position. A Russian or Chinese naval base in Venezuela would give Moscow and Beijing a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, a way to project power into the US's soft underbelly. And while neither power is foolish enough to try that yet, the mere possibility is enough to keep Washington up at night. This is where the Caribbean incident gets interesting. Because while the submarine itself was a non-threat, the symbolism was everything. Maduro wasn't just testing the Ford. He was testing America's resolve. And in doing so, he was sending a message to Moscow, and we're still in the game. Russia, for its part, has been watching Venezuela closely. The Kremlin has a long history of using proxy conflicts to distract and weaken the US, from Syria to Ukraine. And while Putin has no interest in a direct confrontation with Washington, he's more than happy to let Maduro stir the pot. In the weeks leading up to the Caribbean incident, there were unconfirmed reports of Russian military advisors arriving in Venezuela, part of a routine exchange, according to Moscow, but almost certainly a way to signal support. China, meanwhile, has been playing a longer game. Beijing has no desire to see Venezuela collapse, it's too invested in the country's oil and infrastructure. But it's also not willing to bail Maduro out. Instead, it's hedging. It's keeping its options open. And it's watching how the US responds to these kinds of provocations, because China has its own ambitions in the region, ambitions that could one day bring it into direct conflict with Washington. This is the real geopolitical context of the Caribbean incident. It's not just about a submarine and a carrier. It's about the slow, grinding competition between the US, Russia, and China for influence in a region that Washington has long taken for granted. And it's about the fact that, for the first time in decades, the US is no longer the only player in town. Now, I'm not suggesting that Venezuela is some kind of puppet of Moscow or Beijing. Maduro is his own man, and he's making his own calculations. But he's also operating in a world where the rules have changed. Where the US is no longer the undisputed hegemon. Where Russia and China are willing to challenge American dominance, not through direct confrontation, but through 1,000 small cuts, economic pressure, diplomatic maneuvering, and, yes, the occasional submarine stunt. And that's what makes this incident so dangerous. Because in this new world, the old rules of deterrence don't always apply. When you're dealing with a regime that has nothing to lose, the usual calculations, escalation dominance, cost-benefit analysis, go out the window. Maduro didn't send the Caribbean because he thought he could win. He sent it because he had to do something. And that kind of desperation is far more unpredictable than any military strategy. Military and strategic, the illusion of invincibility. Let's talk about the Gerald R. Ford for a moment. Because while the Caribbean incident was a non-event in military terms, it revealed something important about the state of American power. The Ford is the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world. It's a marvel of engineering, a floating airbase with electromagnetic catapults, advanced radar, and a crew of over 5,000. It's designed to project power anywhere on the planet, to deter adversaries, and, if necessary, to fight and win wars. And in this case, it did exactly what it was supposed to. It deterred a threat. But here's the it shouldn't have been necessary. The Caribbean was a relic. A Cold War-era submarine with limited capabilities, crewed by a navy that hasn't seen real combat in decades. The fact that the US had to deploy a $13 billion carrier to counter it is like using a sledgehammer to swat a fly. And that's not a sign of strength. It's a sign of overstretch. The US Navy is the most powerful in the world, but it's also stretched thinner than at any point since the end of the Cold War. It's trying to maintain a global presence, to deter China in the Pacific, Russia in the Atlantic, Iran in the Middle East, and now, apparently, Venezuela in the Caribbean. And while the Ford was able to handle the Caribbean without breaking a sweat, the real question: what happens when the threats start coming from multiple directions at once? This is the central dilemma of American grand strategy today. The US is still the world's sole superpower, but its margin of dominance is shrinking. China is building a navy that could one day challenge the US in the Pacific. Russia is modernizing its nuclear arsenal and extending its influence in the Arctic. And in the meantime, the US is still trying to do everything, everywhere, all at once. The Caribbean incident is a perfect example of this. The US had to send the Ford to the Caribbean not because Venezuela posed a real threat, but because not sending it would have sent the wrong message. It would have signaled weakness. And in a world where adversaries are constantly probing for vulnerabilities, weakness is an invitation to further aggression. But here's this isn't sustainable. The US can't keep deploying carrier strike groups to counter every minor provocation. It can't keep treating every regional power as if it's a peer competitor. And it can't keep pretending that its military dominance is infinite. The Ford may have deterred the Caribbean, but the next time, the threat might not be so easy to counter. And the time after that, the US might not have the resources to respond. This is what the hawks in Washington don't understand. They look at the Caribbean incident and see a victory. A confirmation of American strength. But what they're missing is the bigger picture. This wasn't a victory. It was a warning. A sign that the US is trying to do too much with too little, and that sooner or later, something's going to give. The domestic political why this matters in Washington. Now, let's talk about politics. Because while the Caribbean incident was a military non-event, it was a political earthquake. In Washington, foreign policy isn't just about strategy. It's about optics. And right now, the optics of the Caribbean incident are terrible for the Biden administration. Here's the White House has spent the last year trying to walk a tightrope on Venezuela. On one hand, it's maintained the Trump-era sanctions, which have crippled the Venezuelan economy and pushed millions into poverty. On the other hand, it's quietly explored the possibility of a negotiated settlement, one that would ease sanctions in exchange for free and fair elections. The problem? Neither approach is working. The sanctions haven't toppled Maduro. If anything, they've strengthened his grip on power by giving him an external enemy to rally against. And the negotiations? They've gone nowhere. Maduro has no incentive to make concessions, and the US has no leverage to force his hand. Enter the Caribbean incident. For the Biden administration, this was a nightmare scenario. On one side, you have the Republicans, who are already accusing the White House of being soft on dictators. On the other, you have progressive Democrats, who are pushing for a more conciliatory approach. And in the middle, you have a president who is trying to avoid another foreign policy crisis in an election year. The result? A classic case of overcompensation. The Pentagon's response was swift and decisive. The Ford stayed in the Caribbean longer than planned. The State Department issued a new round of sanctions targeting Venezuelan military officials. And the White House released a statement reaffirming its support for Guaidó, a move that was more about domestic politics than anything else, given that Guaidó's political relevance has all but evaporated. But here's the none of this actually solves the problem. The sanctions won't topple Maduro. The military posturing won't deter future provocations. And the political posturing in Washington won't change the fact that the US is running out of options in Venezuela. This is the domestic. Domestic political theater is only half the story. The other half is what this incident reveals about the shifting military balance in the Caribbean and why that should worry Washington far more than any single submarine stunt. Let me explain why this matters. The Caribbean wasn't just some rogue operation. It was a calculated test of US reaction times, a way for the Venezuelan military to gauge how quickly the Ford's battle group could respond to an asymmetric threat. And here's the uncomfortable: they learned something valuable. The Ford may be the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world, but in the confined waters of the Caribbean, it's also a very large, very expensive target. The US Navy has spent decades preparing for blue water engagements against peer competitors like China, but the real threat in Venezuela's backyard isn't a fleet-on-fleet battle. It's swarms of small, fast attack craft, coastal defense missiles, and yes, even diesel-electric submarines like the Caribbean. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's submarine force isn't some Cold War relic. The Caribbean is a German-built Type 209, acquired in the early 2000s, but it's been modernized with Russian and Iranian assistance. More importantly, it's not alone. Venezuela has two other submarines in its fleet, the Sabalo and the Caribbean's sister ship, the Angostura, and while they're not state-of-the-art, they don't need to be. In the shallow, cluttered waters of the Caribbean, even an aging submarine can be a nightmare for a carrier strike group. The US Navy learned this the hard way during the 2002 Millennium Challenge exercise, when a retired admiral playing the role of an Iranian-style adversary sank multiple US ships using asymmetric tactics. The lesson? In literal warfare, the advantage often goes to the defender, not the high-tech fleet. This brings me to the broader geopolitical implications. The Caribbean incident wasn't just about Venezuela testing the US. It was about Venezuela signaling to its allies Russia, Iran, and China that it's still a player in the region's security architecture. And those allies are paying attention. Russia has already sent nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in the past, and in 2023, it deployed the frigate Admiral Gorshkov to the Caribbean for joint exercises. Iran, meanwhile, has been quietly exiting its military cooperation with Caracas, including the transfer of drones and missile technology. And China? Well, China's interest in Venezuela is less about military posturing and more about economic leverage, but its investments in Venezuelan ports and infrastructure give Beijing a foothold in the region that could one day have military implications. Here's why this should keep U.S. strategists up at night. The Caribbean is no longer a U.S. lake. For decades, the U.S. Navy has treated the region as a secure rear area, a place where carrier strike groups could train in transit without serious threat. But that assumption is eroding. Venezuela's military modernization, combined with the growing presence of U.S. adversaries, means that the Caribbean is now a contested space. And the Ford's deployment wasn't just a show of force, it was a recognition of that new reality. The problem is that the U.S. isn't prepared for this shift. The Navy's focus on great power competition has left it with a force structure optimized for open ocean warfare, not the kind of literal combat that defines the Caribbean. The Ford's battle group is a marvel of engineering, but it's also a high-value target in a region where the rules of engagement are changing. And while the U.S. has invested heavily in anti-submarine warfare, the Caribbean incident proved that even a single submarine can force a carrier to alter its operations. This is where the Biden administration's response falls short. The new sanctions and the extended deployment of the Ford are classic examples of what I call strategic whack-a-mole. They address the symptom, the immediate provocation, but not the underlying problem. The real issue is that the U.S. has no coherent strategy for dealing with Venezuela's military buildup or the broader challenge of great power competition in the Western Hemisphere. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign failed. The Biden administration's half-hearted negotiations have gone nowhere. And now, with the 2024 election looming, the White House is stuck in a reactive posture, responding to each new crisis with a mix of sanctions, military posturing, and political theater. Let me be, this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the erosion of U.S. dominance in its own neighborhood. The Caribbean has always been a strategic choke point, but for the first time in decades, the U.S. is facing a multi-front challenge there. Russia is using Venezuela as a forward operating base. Iran is leveraging its relationship with Caracas to exert its influence in Latin America. And China is quietly building the infrastructure that could one day support a military presence. The U.S. can't afford to treat these developments as isolated incidents. They're part of a larger pattern, one that threatens to undermine U.S. security in the hemisphere. So what's the solution? First, the U.S. needs to recognize that its Venezuela policy is broken. Sanctions haven't worked. Negotiations haven't worked. And military posturing won't work either. The only way forward is a comprehensive strategy that combines targeted sanctions with real incentives for Maduro to step aside, one that addresses the underlying economic and political dysfunction in Venezuela. Second, the U.S. needs to rethink its military posture in the Caribbean. The Ford's deployment was a good start, but it can't be a one-off. The Navy needs to invest in literal combat capabilities, including more small surface combatants and unmanned systems that can operate in confined waters. And third, the U.S. needs to counter the influence of Russia, Iran, and China in the region, not just with military power, but with economic and diplomatic engagement that offers Latin American countries a real alternative to Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. The Caribbean incident was a wake-up call. The question is whether Washington will heed it. If the U.S. continues to treat Venezuela as a secondary theater, it risks ceding the Caribbean to its adversaries. And that's a mistake it can't afford to make. Now, what most people don't realize is that the real battle for Venezuela isn't being fought in the Caribbean, it's being waged in the halls of Miraflores Palace and the crumbling high-rises of Caracas. The submarine incident was a sideshow, a desperate gamble by a regime that knows its days are numbered but refuses to go quietly. The real story is what happens next inside Venezuela, and how the US and its allies respond or fail to respond to the domestic power struggles that will determine the country's future. Let me explain why this matters. Nicolas Maduro isn't just clinging to power because he's stubborn or delusional. He's surviving because he's mastered the art of political jiu-jitsu, turning every crisis into an opportunity to consolidate control. Take the 2018 election, widely condemned as a sham by the US, the EU, and the Lima Group. Maduro didn't just rig the vote, he used the aftermath to purge the military of potential dissidents, arrest opposition leaders, and co-opt the few remaining independent institutions. The result? A regime that looks weaker on paper but is actually more entrenched than ever. The opposition is fractured, the military is divided, and the economy is in freefall. Yet Maduro still stands. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has spent years treating Venezuela as a problem to be solved with sanctions and diplomatic pressure, but it's never had a coherent strategy for what comes after Maduro. The assumption has always been that if the regime collapses, democracy will magically re-emerge. But that's not how authoritarian transitions work. Look at Libya after Gaddafi, or Iraq after Saddam. Power vacuums don't fill themselves with Jeffersonian democracy, they fill themselves with chaos, warlords, and opportunists. Venezuela is no different. The country's institutions are hollowed out, its economy is a shell, and its society is deeply polarized. If Maduro falls tomorrow, there's no guarantee that what replaces him will be any better. So what's the endgame? The most likely scenario is a slow-motion collapse, where Maduro's regime gradually loses its grip but never fully implodes. We've seen this playbook before in Cuba, in Nicaragua, in Zimbabwe. The regime survives by making just enough concessions to keep the international community at bay while tightening its control at home. In Venezuela's case, that could mean allowing limited elections, releasing a few political prisoners, or even lifting some sanctions in exchange for token reforms. But make no Maduro isn't going to step down voluntarily. He's seen what happened to Manuel Noriega, to Saddam Hussein, to Muammar Gaddafi. He knows that surrendering power isn't an exit strategy, it's a death sentence. The wild card here is the military. Venezuela's armed forces are the only institution that could force Maduro out, but they're also the reason he's still in power. The top brass is deeply complicit in the regime's corruption, from drug trafficking to gold smuggling. The lower ranks, meanwhile, are demoralized and underpaid, but they're also terrified of what comes in. The US has tried to peel off military leaders with promises of amnesty and sanctions relief, but so far, no one has taken the bait. Why? Because Maduro has done a masterful job of ensuring that the cost of defection is higher than the cost of loyalty. The moment a general even hints at disloyalty, he's arrested, exiled, or worse. Now, let's talk about the opposition. For years, the US and its allies have pinned their hopes on Juan Guaidó, the self-proclaimed interim president who was recognized by more than 50 countries. But Guaidó's moment has passed. His approval ratings have plummeted, his coalition is in disarray, and his international backers are losing patience. The problem isn't just Guaidó, it's the fact that the opposition has never been able to offer a credible alternative to Chavismo. They've spent years arguing over who gets to lead, while Maduro has spent years dismantling the institutions that could make their leadership meaningful. The result is a political class that's more interested in fighting each other than in governing. Here's where things get really messy. If Maduro's regime does collapse, the most likely outcome isn't a democratic transition, it's a power struggle between the military, the opposition, and the regime's hardliners. The military could split into factions, with some backing a transitional government and others trying to hold on to power. The opposition could fracture along ideological lines, with moderates pushing for negotiations and radicals demanding a complete purge of Chavismo. And the hardliners, men like Diosdado Cabello, the regime's second-in-command, could try to stage a coup to prevent Maduro from being ousted. The result would be a Venezuela that looks less like a democracy and more like a failed state. The US needs to be prepared for this scenario. That means having a plan for what comes after Maduro, one that goes beyond sanctions relief and diplomatic recognition. It means working with regional allies to stabilize Venezuela's economy, rebuild its institutions, and prevent a humanitarian catastrophe. It means offering real incentives for the military to defect, not just empty promises of amnesty. And it means recognizing that the opposition isn't a monolith. Some factions are willing to negotiate, while others are bent on revenge. The US can't afford to pick favorites. It needs to work with all of them to ensure a peaceful transition. But here's the: none of this will happen if the US continues to treat Venezuela as a secondary theater. The Biden administration has been distracted by Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East, and Venezuela has fallen to the bottom of the priority list. That's a mistake. Venezuela isn't just a humanitarian crisis, it's a geopolitical tinderbox. If the regime collapses without a plan in place, the result could be a regional catastrophe, with millions more refugees flooding into Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean. And if Maduro survives, he'll only become more emboldened, using Venezuela as a base to project power across Latin America. The US needs to wake up to the reality that Venezuela isn't just a problem to be managed, it's a crisis to be solved. That means investing real resources in a post-Maduro transition, not just throwing sanctions at the problem and hoping it goes away. It means working with allies like Colombia and Brazil to contain the fallout from a potential collapse. And it means recognizing that the Caribbean is no longer a US lake, it's a contested space where Russia, China, and Iran are all vying for influence. The submarine incident was a warning. The next crisis could be much worse. If the US doesn't act now, it may not get another chance. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's submarine gambit wasn't just a desperate stunt, it was a calculated test of American resolve. Maduro's regime has spent years studying US responses to provocations, from the 2019 drone attack on Nicolas Maduro himself to the 2020 incursion by Silver Corp mercenaries. Each time, the message was the US is allergic to escalation in its own backyard. The submarine incident was Maduro's way of asking a simple "how far can I push" before Washington actually pushes back? The answer, so far, has been not very far at all. And that's the problem. The US has spent decades treating Latin America as a secondary theater, a place where great power competition plays out in slow motion while the real action happens in Eastern Europe or the South China Sea. But Venezuela isn't some backwater, it's a country with the world's largest oil reserves, a coastline that controls the southern approaches to the AMA Canal, and a regime that has spent the last decade embedding itself with America's adversaries. When Maduro sent that submarine to shadow the Gerald Ford, he wasn't just flexing for domestic propaganda. He was sending a signal to Moscow, Beijing, and we're open for business. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has no coherent grand strategy for Venezuela because it has no coherent grand strategy for Latin America at all. The last time Washington had a real plan for the region was the Monroe Doctrine, and even that was more of a warning than a roadmap. Since then, US policy has oscillated between neglect and overreach: neglect when things are quiet, overreach when a crisis erupts, and then back to neglect once the headlines fade. The Obama administration's opening to Cuba in 2014 was supposed to be a reset, but it was quickly overshadowed by the rise of the Bolivarian alliance and the collapse of Venezuela's economy. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign was a masterclass in how not to conduct regime change operations. It relied on sanctions that hurt ordinary Venezuelans more than the elite, and it offered no viable path to a post-Maduro future. And now, under Biden, Venezuela has become a bargaining chip in domestic politics, with the administration alternately easing and tightening sanctions depending on which way the electoral winds are blowing. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela isn't just a humanitarian disaster, it's a geopolitical black hole, and the longer the US dithers, the more it sucks in America's adversaries. Russia has already established a military foothold in Venezuela, deploying nuclear-capable bombers to Caracas in 2018 and signing a $4 billion arms deal with Maduro in 2022. China has turned Venezuela into a testing ground for its debt trap diplomacy, with Beijing now holding over $60 billion in Venezuelan debt that Caracas can't repay, which means China effectively owns a chunk of Venezuela's oil infrastructure. And Iran has used Venezuela as a hub for its proxy networks, with Hezbollah operatives reportedly moving freely between Caracas and Beirut. The submarine incident wasn't just about testing the Gerald Ford, it was about testing the limits of this new axis of resistance in America's backyard. So what should the US do? The first step is to stop treating Venezuela as a problem to be contained and start treating it as a battleground to be won. That means 3: pressure, incentives, and planning. Pressure, because Maduro only responds to force. The US needs to make it clear that there will be consequences for further provocations, not just sanctions, but real costs. That could mean interdicting Iranian oil shipments to Venezuela, as the US did in 2020 when it seized 4 tankers bound for Caracas. It could mean reviving the Operation Martillo maritime interdiction campaign, which disrupted drug trafficking routes in the Caribbean during the Obama years. And it could mean finally designating Venezuela as a state sponsor of terrorism, which would cut off the regime's access to the global financial system. The goal isn't to strangle Venezuela, it's to strangle Maduro. Incentives, because the only way to break the regime's grip is to split the elite. The US has spent years offering amnesty to Venezuelan officials, but those offers have always been vague and conditional. What if, instead, the US offered a clear path to immunity for military officers who defect, along with guarantees of safe passage and financial security? What if it worked with Colombia and Brazil to create a regional stabilization fund, offering economic aid to Venezuelan municipalities that break away from Maduro's control? And what if it finally recognized that the opposition isn't a monolith, and that some factions, like the one led by Maria Corina Machado, are willing to negotiate, while others are bent on revenge? The US can't afford to pick favorites. It needs to work with all of them to ensure a peaceful transition. And planning, because the alternative to a managed transition is chaos. The US needs to start gaming out worst-case scenarios. What happens if Maduro dies suddenly? What happens if the military fractures? What happens if Russia or China intervenes to prop up the regime? The Biden administration has been so focused on Ukraine and Taiwan that it hasn't devoted the resources to answer these questions. That's a mistake. Venezuela is a ticking time bomb, and if it explodes, the fallout won't just be a regional crisis, it will be a global one. The submarine incident was a wake-up call. The next crisis could be a nightmare. And if the US doesn't act now, it may not get another chance to shape the outcome. The question isn't whether Venezuela will collapse, it's when. And the question isn't whether America's adversaries will exploit that collapse, it's how. The only question left is what the US is going to do about it. So far, the answer has been not enough. That needs to change. Because in geopolitics, as in physics, nature abhors a vacuum. And right now, Venezuela is a vacuum, and the wrong people are rushing in to fill it.